Do you know what today is?
No.
It's National Coming Out Day.
Really?
Do you think we should tell the podcast?
The podcast is gay?
The podcast, you guys, this podcast is gay. Surprise. Do you think this is the gayest politics podcast in existence?
Oh, there are a lot of gay podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk.
I'm Nate Silver.
And this is Model Talk. It's been a minute since we've done that. It's been like 3 weeks, I think.
Is it semi-weekly or bi-weekly ordinarily?
Well, it's usually every other week, but we've had
What's that mean? By the way, which is which?
Bi-weekly and semi-weekly.
Yeah.
Okay, bi-weekly means
Twice a week
and every other week. I think it means both. Like, I'm pretty sure I looked this up before, that bi-monthly is either twice a month or every other month.
Yeah, can we just get rid of that word?
Yeah, we should get rid of that word.
Yeah, but semi-weekly means...
I don't know what that means either.
Twice a week.
So it's been 3 weeks because we had a bunch of emergencies. We had a special episode last week and an emergency podcast last week, but we are here now. So let's check in on the model. The House is moving in favor of Democrats. The Senate is moving in favor of Republicans. And just to get the numbers out there, Democrats have a 78% chance of taking the House. Republicans have an 81% chance of keeping their majority in the Senate. Why the
What
opposite
happened
movement?
to the fractions,
odds,
man?
I know. Well,
7 and 9.
I guess I wanted to change it up
5.
a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, and we should say, like any movement in a model, this is relative to where you measure it from. The GOP is in the best position since we launched the model in the Senate. Democrats are not at their high in the House. They're up a little bit from a week ago when they fell down to 74%. But in general, we've seen divergence between the two models. And there are 3 theories about this, one of which we'll get out of the way quickly, but, could be noise. These are not gigantic moves, but they're medium-sized moves. I tend to think there's enough polling data coming in where it's not just noise, right? Second theory, which is, probably the popular pundit theory, is that,
Kavanaugh.
It's Kavanaugh-related, and you saw a split where it helped Republicans in very red districts, maybe not so much in swing districts, and so therefore, because in the House you have purplish red districts instead of very red states, that maybe there was a dividing line there, right? Theory 3, which is my theory,
all right,
not exclusive with theory 2, is that maybe it's about incumbents. It was a shit show, the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. Incumbents became less popular, and when that happens, Democratic incumbents have lots of liability and exposure in the Senate, but almost none in the House, because it's all Republican incumbents in swing districts in the House, right? So if the mood becomes more anti-incumbent, that would tend to help Democrats in the House and would tend to help Republicans in the Senate.
But that's still, it sounds like you said, a byproduct of the Kavanaugh episode.
It might be. Clearly people were paying attention to Kavanaugh. It also might not be. It could also be that, things get baked in late in the election anyway. One thing it's not surprising to see when you get into October is for blue states to become bluer and red states to become redder. People who might not have known their candidate's name will say, you know what, I've heard enough now. I saw some ad. I don't even care if I know who this person is. I'm a Republican, so I'm going to vote for the Republican, whatever else. And so it's not surprising to see partisanship kick in at a stronger dosage at a month or so before the election. I don't know. The polling's been weird.
I don't know how useful generic ballot polling is at this point, at least for predicting the outcomes. But it looks like both Republicans and Democrats have ticked up in generic ballot polling. So the spread is still about 8.5 points. But does that show us that voters are deciding who they're going to vote for and that there are fewer undecideds?
Yes, that's exactly what it shows. And so, yeah, you actually see both parties getting, it's very typical toward the end of an election. The vote tends to lock in, undecideds come off the sidelines. Also, pollsters switch to using likely voter models instead of registered voter models. And there has been some movement back and forth in the generic ballot. You could maybe tell a story where in the very recent days, there's been a little bit of a tick back up toward Democrats after Republicans had a good couple of weeks, and there are questions about timing. So one thing, if you're listening at home, pretty important to pay attention to the dates when a poll was conducted. It seems like Democrats had a series of pretty bad polls right at the apex of the Kavanaugh confirmation. So the last week of September and the first few days of October seem like, on a relative basis, because remember, all the data is pretty good for Democrats, but it has to be very good for Democrats to win the Senate. In a relative basis, Republicans had, in my view anyway, a strong or in the model's view, I should say, because the model crunches these numbers, had a strong week of polling that like last week of September, first few days of October. In polls, since he was confirmed last week, since Kavanaugh was, a little bit less clear. Those look a little bit more like the early mid-September polls, although with weird exceptions, right? Like in the Senate, the GOP polling has been quite good no matter what, right? In the House, it's been pretty bad, and the generic ballot in the past few days has seemed to maybe shift a little bit back toward Democrats. So we don't know a ton more, except that we do know that the Senate was always a very heavy lift for Democrats, and it's become heavier.
Are there any geographic or partisan trends in terms of where Republicans are improving in the Senate?
I don't think we have enough granularity in the data to go regional or geographic, right? Mm-hmm. I do think we can say that, like, clearly Republicans are gaining ground in red states.
Are Democrats gaining ground in blue states? Like, is Bill Nelson doing better in Florida? I mean, that's not a blue state; it's a purple state. But
there aren't very many blue states, so that's a part of the problem that's like kind of opaque to us, right? We don't. There just isn't a lot of polling in blue states, but yeah, in purple states, I mean, you continue to see all these Midwestern states, which is the dog that didn't bark, right? So Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. Whenever you get polls in those states, although Minnesota, we actually need more polls because there's a non-incumbent race there, the race where Tina Smith, the appointed, come in. We would love another poll of Tina Smith's race.
Anybody out there listening?
Anyone out there
want a poll?
And lots of interesting congressional districts in Minnesota. Minnesota, I should say, for a state with a rich political tradition, has always had little and or bad polling. So get your act together, Minnesota.
All right, you heard it from Nate.
Right now, I'm reading the Marquette University Law School poll.
Yeah, they always do a lot of polling in Wisconsin. There's usually some pretty good polling of Wisconsin, right?
I tell you what, man, go poll Minnesota too. Just do Minnesota.
All right, Charles Franklin.
Do some oversamples of the congressional districts there. We would love some Minnesota data.
But on your topic of the Midwest, we're going to get to listener questions later, but actually Katie wrote in and said, like, I don't understand, why is Senator Sherrod Brown such a lock in Ohio, for example? Like, it seems as though a lot of these races that coming off of the 2016 election might have been close or questionable just aren't.
Yeah, and Brown's a guy where our model would say, hey, Ohio has gotten a lot redder. He's pretty liberal in a moderate state, right? So Brown's a guy that could have been vulnerable and just has not been. I guess I attribute that to, like, first of all, the GOP candidates in the Senate are not spectacular in the Midwest, although that's always a little circular, right? Candidate emerges and you're like, okay, she's better than I thought, right? But you have sort of second tier, not bottom tier, but sort of second tier, middle tier candidates running. On the other hand, you might say, hey, look, these are still basically swing states. In fact, they tend to be swingier, as we call it, more elastic than their places. It's a good Democratic year overall. And so you would expect Democratic incumbents to do well. So, I mean, that's the bifurcated story, is like, Ohio is a fairly red state at this point, and Brown seems to be cruising. And then you get a little bit redder. You get to Missouri or Indiana, and you have Democrats who are in a lot of danger, for example. It all is a reminder of, like, a lot of these races are being contested in states that are 20 or 30 or 35 points more Republican than the country as a whole. And so that's why you can have Heidi Heitkamp, despite a blue tide, let's not call it a wave yet, despite the incumbency advantage, she's behind.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll get to listener questions because there are a lot. But when we first launched the model, you said the odds are that one of the forecasts is wrong, either the House or the Senate. Do you feel like we're getting into territory where you may no longer feel that way, where it's clear that Democrats are likely enough to take the House and Republicans are likely enough to keep the Senate, where the odds are not necessarily in favor of one of the forecasts being wrong?
Well, yeah. So basically right now there's almost no chance, not zero, but like would really be a long shot, like 1 in 50 or 1 in 100, that you have Democrats win the Senate but not win the House. The Senate map is so much worse for Democrats that, like, if they are doing well enough to win the Senate, they're going to do very, very well in the House in all probability, right? Flip side of that being, if they don't have enough oomph to win the House, no way are they going to win the Senate. Almost no way. Let's qualify that, right? So in that sense, you can just kind of take it in a pretty linear way, where every time Democrats win the Senate, which is 20% of the time, they also win the House. Every time Republicans win the House, which is also about 20% of the time, they also win the Senate. So that means you right now have like a 20% chance of a Democratic sweep, a 20% chance of a GOP sweep, and a 60% chance of a split. That spread has increased. So now...
Because when we first launched, I think it was like a 51% chance that either the Senate forecast or the House forecast.
But it's still like, there's still a 2 in 5 chance, a 40% chance that so it's slightly better than a coin flip that there will be a split, but not a lot better than a coin flip.
And if Republicans had to choose which chamber they wanted to keep, they could keep both. But if they had to choose, it would be the Senate, right? And that's because of judicial nominations.
Yeah, I think they keep the Senate. It's tough, I think they keep the Senate. And the other thing about the Senate is that you keep a seat for 6 years. And so every seat they win, although there are also a lot of scenarios where they lose a seat net and yet don't lose the Senate overall, right? And so that's the other thing to keep in mind about the Senate is the margin matters a lot. If Democrats lose 3 seats on net, which is very possible, that's a whole different scenario for 2020 than it is if they gain a seat and wind up stuck on 50-50. And let's say it is 50-50. Mike Pence is a tie-breaking vote. You still have Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are problematic. You have Mitt Romney, although you also lose the Flakes and the Corkers, and you lose some of the other more moderate members.
Senator Romney.
He seems very likely to win. That would be a real surprise if Mitt Romney did not win.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to some listener questions. But before we do that, a word from this episode's sponsor. Today's installment of Model Talk is brought to you by Sunbasket. Sunbasket has been rated the #1 meal kit by leading publications, and it's no wonder why. They offer 18 weekly recipes with options for paleo, gluten-free, Mediterranean, lean and clean, vegan, and more. The bottom line is that Sunbasket helps you eat healthier. It's as simple as that. You can now get more options than ever. Just go to the Sunbasket app and pick from 18 weekly recipes, easy-to-cook dishes like Moroccan chicken with cauliflower rice and warm carrot salad. Sunbasket works with the best farms and suppliers to bring you fresh, organic produce and responsibly raised meats and seafood. Everything is pre-measured and delivered to your door. You can get a healthy and delicious meal on the table in as little as 15 minutes. There's something for everyone, so you can be your kind of healthy. Go to sunbasket.com/politics today to learn more and get $35 off your first order. That's sunbasket.com/politics for $35 off. Sunbasket.com/politics. I hope you already ate lunch because that chicken sounded good.
Hey, can I give another plug?
Yeah.
If you are a restaurant with good lunch food, come open a branch on the Upper West Side.
I'm with that. I eat just about the same thing every day. Anyway, we are back, and it's time for some listener questions. Nate, are you ready?
As always.
As always. Okay, here we go. Ellie says, I've noticed that fairly consistently, both overall and for individual races, the classic version of the model gives Democrats the highest likelihood of winning, as opposed to the deluxe or light version. Any idea why that might be? I didn't fact check that, so I don't know that that's true.
I don't really think I don't consider these differences appreciable at this stage. So we're showing in the House 77% chance for Democrats in light, 78% classic, 75% deluxe. To me, the story there is actually one of consistency. And then in the Senate, they're all between 19 and 20%, right? So what that's saying is actually the various indicators have converged, that the polls are about what you would expect based on the fundamentals, that the experts at Cook Political et al. See the race the same way. And so now there's really a meeting of minds between these different forecasts.
And it has been a little while since our last model talk, so maybe Ellie's question is a little old. We still appreciate it. Thank you. Next question. Kyle asks, I was wondering how possible it is to break out different sources of uncertainty, such as polling error, turnout modeling error, undecided voters, the possibility of late breaking news or surprise developments. Are some of these factors of uncertainty larger than others? Does the model treat any of them differently, or is there one monolithic block of uncertainty?
No,
That's a good question, I think.
Yeah. There are a lot of different components to the uncertainty that have to do with how much time there is until the election, that have to do with the possibility of correlated errors or errors in individual districts that happen to do with how much polling there is in a district. One thing the model looks at is how much disagreement there is. So in a district like West Virginia 3, where the fundamentals would say that Ojeda, the Republican or the Democratic candidate, should not be competitive there. But polls show a close race. So the model will say, you know what, I have no effing idea what's going on in West Virginia 3, so I'm going to assume there's wider uncertainty there. But if you want to be more conceptual, I think of it as if a party is trailing in the forecast then it has 3 ways to win. So let's take the GOP in the House, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Way number 1 is, you'd lose if the election were today, but there's still time for things to change. The second way is the micro way. So let's say that polls overall are about accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you win just by getting lucky in some of the toss-up
every
races?
single toss-up?
Most of them, at least, right? That scenario, I think, is debatable in both the House and the Senate right now. I mean, literally, if the GOP won every toss-up race, they would win,
They would keep
right?
it, yeah.
But, they have to win a pretty clear majority of those. They have to hold all these lean Republican seats, of which there are a lot, and they're all very different types of races. So that's a little bit on the fringe. I'd say, yes, that option is still on the table for the GOP, but, that's the one that kind of ebbs and flows back and forth. When you have Democrats at a relatively low watermark in the forecast, like a week ago or so, that scenario is very much alive. Once they get up to a 8.5, 9 point lead on the generic ballot or the popular vote, then that just becomes kind of hard. And the third way is, can there be a systematic polling error? So things are off by a couple of points, right, in a way that's consistent with how far off polls are routinely, not just in theory, right? But and clearly, yes, the GOP can win that way as well. But so 2.5 of those 3 ways to win are still on the table for the GOP. And the Senate, 2 out of the 3, I think Democrats are now at a point where they've had enough difficult polling in North Dakota and Tennessee, maybe in Texas a little bit, right? So in the Senate, maybe we're now at a point where the polling either has to change or be wrong, right? If you held the Senate
They're not
election,
just going to get lucky, given if the polling were correct as it is today, they're not just going to get lucky.
Well, it's borderline, right?
Okay.
It's, if you held the Senate election today and Democrats won the Senate, then, I don't know, it's Tennessee and Texas are a little borderline, right? Mm-hmm. But I think you might say that if Democrats won the Senate, that polls did not have a great night. But we're kind of right at the margin in both chambers.
Okay, so to answer Kyle's question, the forecast does consider different sources of uncertainty. Conceptually, there are 3 different kinds of uncertainty. We've just laid them out.
Yeah, so local, national, and time-based, right? If you want to break those down, then they're actually different components of local error and national error. But we'll even for this podcast,
send a follow-up email, Kyle, if that wasn't enough, if you still need more. Okay, on to the next question. And this is related, and we actually get plenty of questions about turnout because I think it's, something that people kind of obsess over because they know that pollsters have to model turnout based on some assumptions. But Alan asks, how accurate have pollsters been in previous midterm elections in predicting the level of turnout? And is the available data this year all consistent in terms of predicting the level of turnout?
We don't know because pollsters don't list their turnout predictions, and so there's not really a lot of way to evaluate that. I wish pollsters did. I think the Upshot's doing that. They're actually saying, here's how many people we expect to turn out. I mean, that would be super useful if pollsters did that, but they don't. So I don't know how to answer that.
And is that something that we can judge after the fact?
You can look at the comparison between likely and registered voter polls, and if the registered voter polls are more accurate, then I guess you could say that their turnout models were wrong. Mm-hmm. This year, there's not really much of a difference, and so that wouldn't be a good heuristic either. No, I mean, there are other ways to evaluate it, right? If you look at the demographic crosstabs of polls, you can compare, is it that, let's say Democrats have a really, really good night on November 6th and win several states and districts we don't expect them to, right? Is that because the margins are different among different groups, or because Latino turnout is higher than they project, and the partisan makeup of the electorate is different than they project? So you can analyze that, I say, but it's not there's not a simple snap way to do it. You actually have to do work,
and it's not really something that we can do until after the fact.
No, not really. I mean, just in general, as a general principle, a poll isn't wrong until the election happens.
Right.
So when you have contradictory data and lately we have had, I think, a lot of contradictory data,
there's no way to know who's right.
You're not some super genius every now and then a poll will do something that's just wrong. Mm-hmm. We've seen in the history of doing this, literally a case where the numbers for the candidates were inverted, or the names were inverted rather, right?
And that was just a mistake.
So there literally are mistakes, and sometimes, you can have bugs, right? But for the most part, polls are right or wrong based on, well, some pollsters would hate saying this, right? But they're right or wrong based on how well the margin of the poll compares to the actual results. And until you know the actual results, then there's not that much you can say. With that said, over time, the pollsters that are more methodologically rigorous tend to produce more accurate results.
A last question before rapid fire. This is kind of a long question, but hopefully we can answer it somewhat concisely. So Bob asks, envision 2 outcomes for the midterms. 1, and this is in the House. 1, the blue wave turns into a tsunami and they pick up more than 60 seats. 2, the GOP loses very few seats and holds the House. For each of these scenarios, what are you seeing right now that could have been a hint that one of these 2 would happen? So is there any evidence you're seeing right now that this could really turn into a tsunami? Is there any evidence you're seeing right now that this could really turn into a trickle where Republicans keep the House?
So the fundraising data is very good for Democrats. By the way, that will start filtering in. The September 30th fundraising data will start filtering into our model over the next week or so, I think beginning on October 15th. And that will probably help Democrats in the fundamentals part of our calculation a bit. But no, so a story that's plausible is that you have very high Democratic engagement as evidenced by hard evidence, meaning the amount of money donated by small donors and special elections, which we haven't talked about much, right? And so pollsters, maybe they were being too conservative, right? You know, and projecting that there isn't a difference between likely and registered voters. Maybe the electorate that actually shows up on November 6th is quite Democratic and, yeah, right?
And it's a tsunami.
And the flip side of that is maybe voters in their heart of hearts, you know, number one, I mean, polls have been off biased against Republicans 2 years in a row. I think that tends not to necessarily be predictive, and 2 times isn't that many, nor is 3 for that matter. But still, you know, maybe pollsters are missing certain types of demographics and haven't really corrected that problem. Maybe also people look at the economy and they say, you know what, the economy is pretty good. It's not a huge factor in midterm elections, but like Trump has kept some of his promises. The mood of the country isn't actually that negative necessarily.
37%, as we discussed on the live show, right?
Yeah, maybe something, and then maybe you say, okay, well, maybe Kavanaugh galvanized Republicans, right? And so, yeah, at some point Democrats were more engaged, but when the chips were down, their voters turned out. So, I mean, it's easy to imagine, like, you know.
All right, there's your 2 takes. So if what we expect to happen doesn't happen come November 6th, just pick one of those guys. Okay, let's get to our rapid-fire round of questions. First one up, James asks, are states with a consistent history of polling errors favoring one party or the other factored into the model? Meaning, if polls are always off in one particular state, and he pointed to Nevada actually in particular, do we consider that in how we judge the polls that come out of that state?
No. We basically, well, indirectly, right? Because pollster ratings will reflect off in the local pollster. So if you have a pollster that's always off, right, and the local polls are dominated by historically inaccurate pollsters, then that will factor in because it'll weight the polls less and have more error. But we tend to, like, in general, assume that the slate is wiped clean each year, and we don't kind of carry over a penalty from cycle to cycle.
Pete asks, have you ever thought about creating ways for people to interact with the model? For example, a slider that changes the generic ballot to see how the model would predict the race.
Yeah, we've thought about it.
And we decided no.
You know, we do have 2 new openings on our interactive team. And so if you want to help us program things like that and add new features and functionality, you can join our team just in time for the start of the 2020 election cycle, which will be 2 years long, by the way. So look for a job posting soon.
All right, you heard it here. That was a great segue. Okay, next question. What are the chances that Murkowski stays a Republican in the event of a 50-50 Senate? Is there an actual way to model that?
I don't know if there's a way to model it. I mean, you could look at but it's not uncommon to see party switchers after a midterm. And she, I think, is the one that, especially post-Kavanaugh, would be a risk, in part because, I think electorally, she's always kind of relied on a coalition that included what Democrats you have sometimes in Alaska, because there aren't a lot of Democrats necessarily. And so if she wanted to caucus as an independent with the Democrats a la Angus King, I'm not sure that would hurt her. So let's take the scenario where Democrats have a really good night in the House. Let's say they gain 46 seats. They sweep all these governor's races, right? They win the popular vote for the House by 9 or 10 points, right? This is not an overly rosy scenario. It's well within the
range of possibilities,
meaty part of the bell curve. But they're 50-50 in the Senate. I don't know what she does there, you know? I mean, there'd be lots of incentives from Democrats to try and do different things. I mean, but we would see, although that scenario too, remember any special election that you have, right? Now, all of a sudden, if Trump wants to appoint a current Republican senator to his cabinet, if that triggers a special election.
Secretary of State Mitt Romney, wasn't that going to happen once?
Yeah.
Anyway, so possible, but we don't have a model for you. Okay, next question. We have listeners that keep emailing us asking where their money would best help Democrats. So if they're a Democrat and they want to help Democrats, which races should they donate to? I guess a lot of you are Democrats. But anyway, I'm going to ask the question. If you want to help Republicans the most, where should you donate your money?
It's pretty simple. Close races where there has not been a lot of money raised, particularly where the candidate from the party that you favor has less money, because there is diminishing marginal returns, right? So if you were able to find if you're a Republican, find a lean Democratic race where the Republicans only raised in the House $200,000 and the Democrat has $1 million, right? The marginal money for the Republican would go a fairly long way there, or flip the parties if that's the way you roll. But yeah, you don't want to bandwagon on the races that already have millions of dollars.
So Republicans are totally happy, Democrats, when you just keep giving all of your money to Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah.
Okay, our last question is, Ben asks, the 538 podcast recently disappeared from Google Play Music. Will it be coming back? Actually, this is a question that I can answer.
Gale, yeah, way to ask yourself
We've gotten a lot of these questions. Okay, so the 538 Politics podcast is no longer on Google Play Music. Google has a podcast app, so go listen to us there. Apologies if that's a disappointment to you. There are lots of great places to listen to podcasts.
Your apology is not accepted.
Sorry, guys.
How would they hear that if they aren't able to get the podcast?
I know. I was thinking about whether or not this would be particularly helpful, but hopefully maybe they went to a different podcast player thinking that when it went back to Google Play Music, they would continue there. And now they know that it's never coming back. Hopefully you still manage a way to find this podcast somewhere else. Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Model Talk. Nate, it's been real.
It has been. How many more episodes of Model Talk? Just one more?
Well, we'll probably pick up the pace as we get closer to the election because I think we're going to start doing more podcasts per week in general. Any plans for this weekend other than the governor's model?
I hope the governor's model is done before the weekend, in fact, Galen.
Oh, fair enough. But we're not publishing it this week, right?
Well, it's not, it's not my part of the... no, I don't think so.
Okay, so keep an eye out for that maybe next week. I'm Galen Druk. Tony Chow is in the control room. We'll be recording another Model Talk again soon, so send us your questions either on Twitter or at podcasts@538.com. Also, go rate us on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about the show. That's all she wrote. We will see you on Monday.